Chapter 49. After hearing Jianxin's words, the students behind Jianxin, with the exception of Tower, all showed a trace of surprise. They looked at Jianxin with strange gazes, and even more people doubted their ears. In their opinion, if you want to hand over the magic nuclei, then hand over the magic nuclei. Why do you have to care about the size of the teacher's desk? Isn't this just looking for trouble? Who is that person? He really doesn't know what's good for him. He actually dares to ask the teacher to change his desk? What an idiot! He actually dares to say that Teacher Steve's desk is too small in front of so many people. What's even more inconceivable is that he dares to ask Teacher Steve to change his desk. Heavens, he actually dares to talk about Teacher Steve's desk. Doesn't he know that Teacher Steve is the strictest teacher in our Kargath Academy? Many people began to point and discuss Jianxin. They looked at him as if they were looking at an idiot. The expression of the old man in charge of the examination changed slightly. He frowned slightly and stared at Jianxin with a sharp gaze. He coldly snorted and said in a deep voice, "What's your name? How dare you talk about our teacher's head? This desk was prepared long ago. How can you change it just because you say so?" Not only did Jianxin's words make the teacher in charge of the examination angry, even the other teachers in charge of the examination couldn't help but frown. They looked at Jianxin with displeasure. Jianxin's words were completely disrespectful to them as teachers. Among them, none of them thought that Jianxin's reason for changing his desk was because this desk simply couldn't fit all the magic nuclei in his space belt. Of course, there were a few teachers who were the exception. Their expressions were very calm, and only a faint smile hung on their faces. They were the ones who saw Jianxin and Tower kill a pack of green wolf kings in the second area. At this moment, a very beautiful girl in the back of the line stared suspiciously at Jianxin's figure with a pair of bright eyes. She frowned slightly and muttered in a low voice, "Strange, why do I feel that his figure is a bit familiar? Have I seen him somewhere before?" The girl's brows were tightly furrowed as she thought hard. Suddenly, the girl's eyes lit up as a familiar figure appeared in her mind. The next moment, joy and surprise immediately filled the girl's eyes. She subconsciously cried out, "Xianxia, he's Xianxia." The girl didn't conceal her voice at all, so many people heard her. However, after hearing Xianxia's name, the expressions of the surrounding students changed slightly. Some of the students who were cursing Xianxia obediently shut their mouths. Xianxia's name was very famous in Kargath Academy. Almost everyone knew about him. Even so, only a small portion of people had seen Xianxia's true appearance. Most of them were new students. At this moment, although Jianxin had cleaned the dirt on his face, there were still some spots left on it. Moreover, his clothes were tattered, making him look no different than a beggar. If one wasn't familiar with Jianxin's appearance, it was almost impossible to recognize him. That's why no one recognized him even after he had lined up for so long. When he heard the name Xianxia, the old man in charge of the examination was slightly surprised. He couldn't help but take a good look at Jianxin. Obviously, even the teacher in charge of the examination was familiar with Xianxia's name. Even so, Jianxin still didn't have enough ability to make the teacher change the table according to his request. The old man in charge of the examination opened his mouth slightly. Just as he was about to say something, Vice Dean Bai En, who was sitting at the head of the table, suddenly said, "Someone, immediately bring a bigger table here." The Vice Dean had a smile on his face. He didn't show any dissatisfaction because of Jianxin's words. Instead, he looked at Jianxin with some expectation in his eyes. It was as if he had already guessed the reason why Jianxin wanted to change the table. Vice Dean Bai En looked like he was in his 30s or 40s. However, his prestige in Kargath Academy was very high. He was second only to the dean. When he spoke, the teachers immediately became silent. Apart from a few teachers, the rest of the teachers were extremely puzzled by the vice dean's actions. They really couldn't understand why the vice dean would listen to a student and change the table that was originally prepared. After all, the table used by the teacher in charge of the examination was enough to handle the registration of magic cores. There was no need to change to a bigger table. Soon, a 3-meter long and 2-meter wide desk was brought up, replacing the original desk used by the teacher in charge of the examination. Chengyang Shoten, you should be satisfied now. The teacher in charge of the examinations sat in front of the bigger table. His attitude towards Jianchen wasn't very friendly. It was very obvious that Jianchen's request to change the table had left a very bad impression in the heart of this 50 to 60 years old teacher. Feeling the prejudice in the old man's heart, Jianchen couldn't help but reveal a trace of a bitter smile. He didn't expect that because of this matter, a teacher would have a trace of prejudice against him. This matter was completely out of his expectations, but Jianchen didn't care too much about it. Then, Jianchen directly took off his own space belt. He didn't take out the magic cores one by one like the other students. Instead, he directly took out 10 magic cores from the space belt and gently placed them on the table. These magic cores were all pale white and were a size larger than an adult's finger. Seeing Jianchen take out 10 magic cores at once, the old man in charge of the examination was somewhat dissatisfied with Jianchen's behavior, but at this moment, he couldn't help but secretly nod his head. However, just when the old man in charge of the examination thought that these were all the magic cores that Jianchen could take out, Jianchen's hand once again reached into the space belt and continued to take out a large number of magic cores. This time, the number of magic cores he took out was also 10. Now, there were 20 magic cores on the table. Seeing these 20 magic cores, the eyes of the old man in charge of the examinations suddenly lit up. He looked at Jianchen with a bit of surprise and secretly thought to himself, this Chengyang Shoten really lives up to his reputation. His strength isn't that of a saint, but he can defeat a saint. It seems that he really has some ability. Then, Jianchen continued to reach into the space belt and took out a large number of magic cores again and gently placed them on the table. The hard magic cores collided with the wooden table, making a dong 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 sound. Seeing Jianchen take out another 10 magic cores from his space belt, the expression of the old man in charge of the examination changed slightly. His eyes were filled with shock. This was because Jianchen had already taken out 30 magic cores, 7 more than Mu Tian. A student who hadn't even reached the saint level was able to kill 30 class 1 magical beasts in 3 days. Even this old man, who had seen great storms, couldn't help but feel a trace of shock and disbelief in his heart. Even though the attacks of the magical beasts were relatively weak, they were definitely not easy to kill for students who were at the peak of the 10th layer of Saint Force at most. Not only did the old man in charge of the examination become shocked by Jianchen's 30 magic cores, even the other teachers behind him felt a little disbelief. Only the few teachers who knew about Jianchen and Vice Principal Bai En continued to smile. As for the students who were still queuing up, they had long been stunned by the 30 monster cores that Jianchen had taken out. Jianchen did not even look at the shocked expressions of the surrounding teachers and students. Under everyone's focused gazes, Jianchen reached into his space belt again and took out another large number of magic cores, placing them gently on the table. He did not stop there. Under the stunned gazes of the teachers and students, he reached his hand into his space belt again and took out another handful of magic cores. As the magic cores were taken out by Jianchen from his space belt one by one, the large table was soon completely filled with magic cores. Although they were all Class 1 magic cores, due to the different sizes of the magical beasts, their sizes were different as well. The small ones were only a little bigger than a thumb, while the large ones were the size of a child's fist. At this moment, whether it was the teachers or the students, they were all stunned by the number of magic cores Jianchen had taken out. A person who was obviously not a saint had only spent 3 days in the forest to hunt down over 100 Class 1 magical beasts. No one would believe it if they said this. Now, among the teachers and students present, except for a few people, no one would believe that Jianchen had hunted down these magic cores himself. Everyone thought that these magic cores in Jianchen's hand were pieced together from many other people's magic cores. Perhaps he had even used some underhanded means to obtain them. It was impossible for him to have hunted down magic beasts by himself. Now, among the teachers and students present, except for a few people, no one would believe that Jianchen had hunted down magic beasts by himself. Everyone thought that these magic cores in Jianchen's hand were pieced together from the magic cores of many people. Looking at the 100 Class 1 magic cores that had almost filled the table before him, the old man in charge of the examination took a deep breath. Although he was certain that Jianshan had obtained these magic cores through underhanded means, he could not help but admire Jianshan's ability. As for the underhanded methods, the academy would not interfere. This was the law of survival on the Tianyuan continent. Seeing that Jianshan had actually taken out over 100 Class 1 monster cores, Vice Principal Bai En, who was sitting at the head of the table, revealed a look of disbelief. In his heart, he was extremely clear that there were no cases of students fighting over monster cores in the second area. Thus, there was no doubt that Jianshan had obtained these monster cores through robbing. In that case, there was only one explanation left, and that was that Jianshan had obtained these Class 1 monster cores by relying on his own abilities to hunt down magical beasts. Even with Baien's mental fortitude, he could not help but feel deeply shocked when he reached this conclusion. At the same time, he felt extremely doubtful. Did Jianshan and Tai Ta not exhaust themselves at all from hunting the magical beasts? Was the saint force in their bodies limitless? They had actually hunted down so many Class 1 magical beasts that were stronger than them in just 3 days. The old man in charge of the examination glanced at Jianshan with mixed feelings before beginning to count the number of magic cores on the table. He did not ask how Jianshan had obtained these magic cores because he had already reached a certain conclusion. Chapter 50. The magic cores were quickly accounted for, and the old man in charge of the assessment said, "There are a total of 98 magic cores here. This is your space belt. Now, return the space belt that belongs to the academy." As he spoke, the old man took out an emerald green space belt and handed it to Jianshan. This space belt was given to him by his father, Changyang Ba, when he left Changyang Prefecture. Jianshan looked at the space belt that belonged to the academy in his hand and hesitated for a moment before saying, "Teacher, I'll keep this space belt that belongs to me for the time being. I'll return it to the academy after this assessment is over." Hearing this, the old man's brows furrowed slightly and he asked in confusion, "Why?" Perhaps it was because Jianshan had obtained close to 100 magic cores by himself, but the old man's attitude towards Jianshan had clearly changed. "Teacher, I still have Class 2 magic cores in this space belt. I still have to participate in the assessment of Class 2 magic cores later," Jianshan said indifferently. Right now, the assessment was only for Class 1 magic cores. The Class 2 magic cores would have to wait until the Class 1 magic cores had been assessed. "Oh, what? You still have Class 2 magic cores?" Hearing this, the old man's eyes revealed a trace of disbelief. He looked at Jianshan with eyes full of suspicion. He wasn't the only one. Even the other teachers sitting on the high platform had the same expression as him. Jianshan nodded slightly and said, "Yes, teacher." Hearing this, the old man took a deep breath. His gaze towards Jianshan became serious for the first time. At this moment, he realized that he seemed to have underestimated this Changyang Shoten, who had some rumors in the academy. However, he didn't waste his breath on this matter. He waved his hand and said, "All right then, put these magic cores away. You can continue to participate in the second round of assessment." Afterwards, Jianshan placed the 100 magic cores back into his space belt and left the high platform. However, whether it was the teachers on the stage or the surrounding students, their gazes towards Jianshan had completely changed. There was no lack of jealousy, envy, and even disdain in their eyes. After walking down the high platform, Jianshan didn't return to the crowd. Instead, he went to the group of people who were waiting for their Class 2 magic cores to be assessed. Apart from Changyang Hu and a few others, the students who were waiting for their magic cores to be assessed all revealed a trace of surprise and doubt when they saw Jianshan arrive. They hadn't encountered Jianshan in the third region. Clearly, they were very curious about someone who wasn't even a saint yet coming to submit their Class 2 magic cores. They really found it hard to believe that Jianshan dared to enter the third region to hunt Class 2 magical beasts and even obtained at least 2 Class 2 magic cores. Behind Jianshan was Tai Ta. After Jianshan walked down the high platform, Tai Ta also arrived in front of the teacher in charge of the assessment. It was no longer a secret that Tai Ta was the dean of Kargath Academy, so all the teachers in the academy knew Tai Ta. Seeing Tai Ta come up, the old man in charge of the assessment couldn't help but reveal a trace of a smile on his face. He said, "Tai Ta, I wonder what your harvest was this time." Tai Ta chuckled and didn't say anything. Imitating Genshin, he put his hand into his space belt and directly took out a large amount of magic cores and gently placed them on the desk. Because Tai Ta's hand was relatively large, he took out no less than 14 or 15 magic cores. Looking at the 14 or 15 magic cores on the table, the old man in charge of the assessment revealed a trace of a smile on his face. He thought to himself, as expected of the dean. Although he looks a bit silly and lacks shrewdness, his talent is really amazing. After taking out 14 or 15 monster cores, Tai Ta's actions did not stop for even a moment. His palm took out the monster cores that were placed in his spatial belt one by one. Gradually, under the astonished gazes of the first-grade teachers and students, more and more monster cores were placed on the table. There were at least 10 of them. Tai Ta finally stopped when he had taken out over 100 magic cores. Looking at all the magic cores he had collected, Tai Ta chuckled in an honest manner. He said happily, "Teacher, these are the magic cores I've collected." At this moment, the surrounding teachers and students were so shocked that they were speechless. Their gazes were filled with disbelief as they stared at the 100 magic cores on the table. The old man in charge of the assessment sucked in a deep breath. He glanced at Tai Ta deeply and slowly said, "Good, good. Tai Ta, you've done well. You haven't embarrassed your master." With that, the old man lowered his head and began to count the magic cores. He did not ask how Tai Ta had obtained them. In his heart, he had already linked Tai Ta's method of obtaining the magic cores to Genshin. Very soon, the old man finished counting the magic cores. He said, "There are a total of 97 magic cores here." With that, the old man began to record the magic cores on a small notebook. After recording everything, the old man took out a black spatial belt and a badge of honor from under the table. He handed them to Tai Ta and said, "Tai Ta, this is the spatial belt and badge of honor that you've been keeping here. Put away the monster core and return the spatial belt that belongs to the academy." It was obvious with a single glance that this was a high-grade space belt. It had been given to Tai Ta by the headmaster of Kargath Academy after he had become his disciple. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for a commoner like him to wear a high-grade tool like a space belt. Even though space belts were very common on the Tianyuan continent, they were not something commoners could possess. Tai Ta's gaze paused on the black space belt for a while. He shook his head and said, "Teacher, I'll leave this space belt with you for now. I still have Class 2 magic cores." "What? You have Class 2 magic cores as well?" The old man in charge of the assessment was extremely surprised with that. There was some disbelief on his face. A few of the teachers on the platform could not help but look at each other when they heard Tai Ta's words. Disbelief filled their eyes. They had never thought that after Genshin, there would be a student who was not even a saint who had obtained a Class 2 magic core. The old man in charge of the assessment hesitated slightly before asking, "Tai Ta, have you been to the third zone?" Although the old man's question had exceeded his responsibilities, he could not help but feel extremely curious. Even though he had already guessed a thing or two, he could not be certain without hearing the exact details from Tai Ta. Tai Ta nodded slightly and said in a low, muffled voice, "Yes, I have been to the third zone." The old man continued to ask, "Did you obtain the Class 2 magic cores by hunting magical beasts?" Although the old man's question had exceeded his responsibilities, no one came out to stop him. This was because he wasn't the only one who was extremely curious about this matter. Even the teachers on the high platform were the same. They all wanted to know the exact answer in their hearts. A portion of it was obtained by me and Changyang Shoten. Tai Ta did not hide anything, but he only said half of it. Hearing that, the old man's eyes filled with disbelief. He said in surprise, "What? You're saying that you and Changyang Shoten were able to kill a Class 2 magic beast?" Tai Ta nodded and said, "Yes." This answer caused all the teachers on the platform to be extremely shocked. Most of them felt that it was unbelievable. Two people who were not even saints were actually able to kill a Class 2 magic beast. This was the first time this had happened since the establishment of Kargath Academy. Afterwards, Tai Ta collected his magic cores and walked down the platform. He went to the crowd waiting for the Class 2 magic cores to be assessed and stood behind Xianxia. However, at this moment, Xianxia and Tai Ta had become the most eye-catching people in the crowd. Those who had failed the mission standing behind them looked at Xianxia and Tai Ta with jealousy in their eyes. Many of them had been forced to flee miserably from Class 1 magic beasts in the second zone, but they never thought that Xianxia and Tai Ta, who were not much stronger than them, would be able to obtain over 100 Class 1 magic cores in the second zone. They even obtained Class 2 magic cores. This made them feel extremely unbalanced, and many of the older students felt ashamed. Very soon, the assessment of the Class 1 magic cores was completed. Xianxia had obtained the most Class 1 magic cores. He had obtained a total of 98 magic cores, while Tai Ta had obtained one less than Xianxia. The two of them had obtained several times more than Mu Tian, who was ranked third. In the crowd, Mu Tian stared at Xianxia and Tai Ta with a strange light in his eyes. He murmured to himself in a voice that only he could hear, "Tai Ta Changyang Shoten, you really do live up to your reputation. You really are worthy of being able to defeat Saint Realm experts. I really want to find a chance to spar with the two of you." Although Xianxia and Tai Ta had stolen the limelight, Mu Tian did not seem displeased at all. He remained rather calm, as if this was something insignificant to him. It did not affect him at all. At this moment, Changyang who arrived before Xianxia in excitement. He said softly, "Fourth brother, the two of you are just too much. In the past 3 days, each of you has obtained close to 100 magic cores." Changyang whose voice was filled with unconcealable excitement. He looked at Xianxia with pride. Xianxia smiled and said nothing. Suddenly, Xianxia's eyes narrowed slightly. As if he had sensed something, he immediately looked back. He saw a young man in tattered clothes looking at him with resentment. The intense killing intent in his eyes was undisguised. The sharpness of his gaze made Xianxia frown involuntarily. However, when Xianxia carefully examined the young man's appearance, he immediately understood. He was Luo Jian, who had all of his magic cores plundered by Xianxia in the forest. At that time, not only had all of Luo Jian's magic cores been taken away by Xianxia's group without leaving a single one behind, he had also been heavily injured. Although he was not very active, he had completely lost the ability to fight. As a result, the group did not have the ability to steal other people's magic cores or hunt magic beasts. As a result, Luo Jian's group had failed their mission this time. A faint smile appeared on Xianxia's face. There was a trace of disdain between his brows. He did not take Luo Jian seriously at all. Xianxia had seen many people like Luo Jian in his previous life. However, there were very few of them who could truly cause great waves. The second round of examination began very quickly. The students who had reached the Saint Realm and completed the mission walked up the platform one by one. However, there were 2 exceptions. Apart from Xianxia and Tai Ta, who had not reached the Saint Realm, everyone else had reached the Saint Realm. Chapter 51. Very soon, more than 10 people had passed the examination. At this time, it was the turn of a young man with an extraordinary bearing. Although the young man seemed to be in a very sorry state, the arrogance between his brows did not decrease in the slightest. The young man arrived in front of the desk and quickly took out a large pile of monster cores from his spatial belt, placing them on the desk. The old man in charge of the examination clearly recognized the young man. After counting the monster cores on the desk, he said in a rather appreciative tone, "There are a total of 93 monster cores here. Not bad, Qing Mingxiang, your results are very good." Tai Ta's eyes immediately lit up when he heard Qing Mingxiang's name. His eyes were filled with battle intent as he looked at Qing Mingxiang, who was standing in front of the desk. Tai Ta had never forgotten the unfinished battle from last time. At that time, he was not as strong as he was today, especially after 3 days of killing magical beasts in the forest. With some pointers from Xianxia, Tai Ta's battle prowess was much stronger than before. He believed that with his current strength and the little battle experience he had, even if his saint force was inferior to Qing Mingxiang's, he would definitely not lose with his advantage in terms of strength. Although Tai Ta seemed crude, he also understood that this was not the time to compete with Cheng Mingxiang. As a result, he could only glare at Cheng Mingxiang's back angrily before slowly suppressing his strong desire to fight with Cheng Mingxiang. Hearing the old man's praise, Cheng Mingxiang revealed a smile on his face. A trace of pride appeared in his eyes. The old man in charge of the examination buried his head in his notebook and continued, 93 Class 2 monster cores. If nothing unexpected happens, you'll definitely be in the top 3 for Class 2 monster cores this time. And with your talent for cultivation, your future is limitless. Work hard. Thank you for your praise, Teacher Steve. The old man's words of praise made the pride on Cheng Mingxiang's face become even thicker. Afterwards, Cheng Mingxiang returned the spatial belt that belonged to the academy and received his Medal of Honor before walking off the platform. After Cheng Mingxiang left, another student with the same tattered clothes came to the desk and took out a large pile of magic cores from his spatial belt. The amount wasn't much less than what Cheng Mingxiang had obtained. The old man in charge of the assessment smiled and nodded. His gaze paused on the young man's face for a while before he slowly said, "Not bad, Huang Dong. It seems that your harvest this time is also very bountiful." Upon hearing Huang Dong's name, many of the students below the high platform cried out in surprise. Jianshan's expression changed slightly, and his eyes immediately fell on the young man. He was no stranger to the name Huang Dong. Huang Dong was ranked 3rd in the top 10 experts of Kargath College. It was said that his strength had reached the peak of Saint Realm last year, and was only one step away from Great Saint Realm. Once he successfully broke through to Great Saint Realm, it meant that he could graduate. The top 10 experts of Kargath Academy referred to the 10 strongest students. All of them had reached the peak of Saint Realm and were only one step away from Great Saint Realm. Once they reached the Great Saint Realm, they would leave the top 10 experts' range. For the old man's praise, Huang Dong just smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Soon, the old man had finished counting the magic cores on the table. Huang Dong had obtained a total of 95 magic cores, 2 more than Cheng Mingxiang. After Huang Dong left the high platform, several names on the top 10 experts list appeared one after another. Almost all of them had harvested about 9 magic nuclei, and the number 1 on the top 10 experts list, Brigadier, had harvested 103 magic nuclei. However, among the top 10 experts, only 4 people had completed the task. The other 6 had all been eliminated during the task. They had all encountered people of the same level as themselves. In the case of a huge difference in numbers, they had lost to the other party. Moreover, the magic cores in their hands had all been snatched away. Very quickly, the people who were still in the queue of the top 10 experts had already gone down. The people behind them were people who weren't very famous in the academy. And at this time, the number of magic cores that the people in front of them had turned in first place was the number 1 of the top 10 experts, Brigadier. Brigadier had turned in 103 magic cores and was in first place. In second place was Jing Mingyue, who was ranked 5th on the top 10 experts list. She was also the only female on the top 10 experts list in Kargath Academy. This time, she had obtained a total of 101 monster cores, 2 less than Brigadier. The third person was Cheng Mingxiang. He had obtained 93 magic cores. Although Cheng Mingxiang was not in the top 10 experts list, his strength had already reached the high-level Saint Realm. Moreover, he was also one of the top experts in the Kargath Academy. Even compared to the top 10 experts list, he was not much weaker. Moreover, Cheng Mingxiang was known as a cultivation genius in the Kargath Academy. Not only was his cultivation speed faster than many people, even his battle strength was not to be underestimated. After the 3 of them left, everyone was certain that the top 3 spots for Class 2 magic cores would belong to none other than the 3 of them. Because at this moment, the people in the queue were not very famous in Kargas, and their strength was only at the level of primary saint and intermediate saint. Naturally, they could not be compared to the 3 of them. Changyang Hu and the other 3 had snatched a lot of magic cores with Jianshan. Although the 4 of them had only obtained half of the magic cores on average, each of them had about 30 to 40 magic cores. Although the harvest was not very abundant, it was not bad for their strength. After all, they only had the strength of a primary saint realm. Soon, all the students who had reached the saint realm had passed the examination. Although some of them had obtained a lot of magic cores, none of them could surpass the top 3. Now, only Jianxin and Tai Ta were left. At this moment, whether it was the teachers on the high platform or the students below, all of their gazes fell on Jianxin and Tai Ta. The two of them had not reached the saint realm yet, but they were able to kill a Class 2 magical beast. This already made many people feel intense jealousy and unbalanced. At this moment, everyone was guessing how many magic cores the two of them had. Of course, no one would compare the magic cores obtained by Jianxin and Tai Ta with those of the seniors. They all thought that the two of them definitely did not have too many Class 2 magic cores. Jianxin came in front of the old man in charge of the examination and took off his space belt. At this moment, the old man in charge of the examination looked at Jianxin with a hint of praise in his eyes. The prejudice he had against Jianxin just now had disappeared without a trace. Although he had already determined that Jianxin and Tai Ta definitely did not have more than 10 Class 2 magic cores, the fact that they could enter the 3rd region and kill Class 2 magical beasts when they were not even saints made him have a whole new level of respect for Jianxin and Tai Ta. After all, killing Class 2 magical beasts when they were not even saints was definitely a first in Kargath Academy. At this moment, some of the listless teachers sitting on the high platform couldn't help but perk up. Their eyes were full of spirit as they looked at Jianxin. Jianxin glanced at the teachers sitting around him indifferently. When he discovered that they were looking at him with sparkling eyes, he couldn't help but reveal an imperceptible smile on his indifferent face. Then he directly reached his hand into his space belt and took out a large number of Class 2 magic cores and placed them on the table. There seemed to be a total of 9 of them. When they saw Jianxin taking out those 9 Class 2 magic cores, many teachers on the high platform revealed a trace of surprise and disbelief. Obviously, this number had exceeded the expectations of most of them. After all, there was a huge difference in strength between Class 2 and Class 1 magical beasts. According to their original thoughts, Jianxin having 3 or 4 Class 2 magic cores was already amazing enough. They didn't expect him to have as many as 9 Class 2 magic cores. Then, before they could think of anything else, Jianxin once again took out a large number of Class 2 magic cores from his space belt. Now, there were more than a dozen Class 2 magic cores on the table. This number was enough to match the harvest of some students who had reached the Saint Realm in 3 days. Seeing this scene, all the teachers on the high platform revealed an expression of disbelief. Even the old man in charge of checking the magic cores was shocked speechless by Jianxin taking out more than a dozen Class 2 magic cores. Although there were only a dozen Class 2 magic cores, the impact on the teachers' hearts was even greater than when Jianxin had handed in over 100 Class 1 magic cores in one go. After all, these Class 2 magic cores were taken out by a student who hadn't even reached the Saint Realm. At this moment, all the teachers suddenly realized that if these magic cores were taken from the Class 2 magical beasts that Jianxin had killed with his own hands, then his future achievements. When they thought of how he could kill Class 2 magical beasts with his strength that wasn't even at the Saint Realm, and more than a dozen of them in one go, the teachers felt a wave of disbelief in their hearts. Vice President Bai En, who was sitting at the head of the table, revealed a gratified smile on his face as he muttered, "Not bad, not bad, not bad at all. I just don't know how many of these Class 2 magic cores were obtained by killing magical beasts with your own strength. After seeing this, I'll have to investigate properly." After taking out the Class 2 magic cores, Jianxin's actions didn't stop because of this. He once again reached into his space belt and took out another handful of Class 2 magic cores. Then, Jianxin didn't stop moving. Under the shocked and disbelieving gazes of all the teachers, he continuously took out Class 2 magic cores of different sizes from his space belt, filling up the entire table. Looking at the pile of Class 2 magic cores on the table, all the teachers on the high platform fell into a daze. Even the sharp-eyed students below the platform who saw the situation on the table had an expression of disbelief on their faces, as if they had seen something inconceivable. The old man in charge of the examination took a deep breath and forcibly suppressed the shock in his heart, calming himself down. It wasn't that he hadn't seen these magic cores on the table in his life, and he had seen many magic cores that were of a much higher grade and a much larger number. However, the significance of these Class 2 magic cores couldn't be judged by ordinary means. The old man in charge of the examination looked deeply at Genshin, then lowered his head to count the magic cores on the table. Very soon, the magic cores were counted, but at this moment, the old man's expression was filled with shock and disbelief. His emotions that had just calmed down once again surged uncontrollably. He sat in front of the table in a daze, actually unable to open his mouth to report the number of magic cores. After a few breaths, finally, Vice President Bai En, who was sitting at the head of the table, couldn't help but say, "Steve, what are you waiting for? Quickly report the number of magic cores." Vice President Bai En's voice was faintly trembling and excited, but his expression was very calm. Chapter 52. As soon as the voice of the old man in charge of the examination fell, everyone immediately sucked in a breath of cold air. Then the whole place became silent in an instant. It was so quiet that even the sound of a needle dropping on the ground could be clearly heard. This number even shocked Vice President Bai En, who was sitting at the head of the table, to the point that he was speechless. His eyes stared blankly at the large pile of second-rank magic nuclei on the table with a shocked expression on his face. This number had already surpassed Brigadier, who was ranked first in the previous harvest of magic nuclei. After a long time, finally a student couldn't help but shout loudly, "Impossible! This is absolutely impossible. He's not even a saint. How could he harvest so many magic nuclei in the third region? More than a dozen more than Brigadier, who is ranked first in the top 10 experts of the academy. This is absolutely impossible. He must have brought these magic nuclei in from the outside." A stone stirred up 1,000 ripples. Following the words of this student, more and more voices of opposition sounded. Genshin's harvest of nearly 100 first-rank magic nuclei had already made many people jealous and felt very unbalanced. Not to mention, he actually took out another 118 second-rank magic nuclei. In terms of quantity, it was even more than the first-rank magic nuclei. This made all the students of the academy unable to accept. Below the stage, Brigadier, who was currently ranked first in the top 10 experts of Kargath Academy, looked at Genshin's back with a shocked expression and muttered, "His strength is obviously not even a saint. How could he harvest so many second-rank magic nuclei? Could it be that he really brought all the magic nuclei in his hands in from the outside?" Brigadier couldn't help but have such a thought in his heart, but he immediately rejected it because before entering the forest, the academy had already confiscated all the space tools that could be used to carry items on the body of all the students. Moreover, they had also undergone a strict inspection. Moreover, there was only one entrance to the forest. There was simply no opportunity to bring magic nuclei in from the outside. Moreover, even if it was really possible to bring magic nuclei in from the outside, Brigadier believed that no one would be so stupid as to take out more than 100 second-rank magic nuclei in one go, because this was bound to cause a shock in the entire academy. At that time, the academy would definitely send people to investigate this matter. Not far away, although her clothes were very tattered, but her appearance was very beautiful. Her eyes were a little absent-minded as she looked at Genshin's back standing on the stage and muttered, "How is this possible? He is a new student who is not even a saint, yet he actually obtained more than 100 second-rank magic nuclei." The soft and pleasant voice of the young girl was filled with shock and disbelief. On the other side, when the old man in charge of the examination announced the number of magic nuclei that Genshin had obtained, Cheng Mingxiang's mouth was wide open in astonishment. He stared at Genshin standing on the stage with a face full of disbelief. However, his face immediately became gloomy and was completely replaced by anger. This was because the top 3 in terms of the number of magic nuclei obtained from the hunting of magical beasts were all rewarded. Although these rewards were not in the eyes of the children born in big families, for them, it represented a kind of honor and a symbol of strength. Originally, Qing Mingxiang was ranked 3rd, but Jianchen forcefully squeezed him out of the top 3 ranks. This made him very angry in his heart, and what he couldn't accept was that Jianchen's strength was not even a saint. Changyang Shoten. In the blink of an eye, Qing Mingxiang's face had become incomparably gloomy. His gaze towards Jianchen was filled with resentment. In the crowd, Luo Jian's face was also gloomy. His eyes were filled with resentment as he stared at Jianchen on the stage. His sharp gaze was as if he wanted to eat Jianchen alive. Now, although Jianchen's strength was weak, his spirit could be said to be very powerful. If one looked at him with ordinary eyes, he might not be able to sense it. However, if one looked at him with a particularly sharp gaze, his spirit would immediately sense it. Therefore, Luo Jian and Qing Mingxiang's gazes filled with resentment were immediately sensed by Jianchen. Jianchen slightly turned his head, and relying on his powerful spirit to sense the direction, he very easily found Luo Jian, who was submerged in the crowd. Looking at Luo Jian's gloomy expression, Jianchen coldly smiled. He didn't take it to heart. He had robbed all the magic cores in Luo Jian's hands, causing him to be unable to complete his mission. Moreover, he had also injured him. It was normal for him to have resentment towards himself. However, when Jianchen's gaze fell on Qing Mingxiang, his brows slightly wrinkled. At the same time, his face revealed a trace of helplessness. There was no hatred between him and Qing Mingxiang. Previously, when he had a small conflict with Qing Mingxiang outside the library, it was not enough to make Qing Mingxiang resent him so much. The biggest reason for this was because he had squeezed Qing Mingxiang out of the top 3. After all, to be able to obtain the top 3 results in the competition of all the students in the school was simply a great honor for them, especially those disciples who were born in noble families. This honor could simply raise their status abruptly. If it was any other top 10 master who squeezed Qing Mingxiang out of the top 3, he would absolutely not feel any displeasure in his heart. However, this time, the person who squeezed him out of the top 3 was not a top 10 master, but a freshman who he had never put in his eyes. This made Qing Mingxiang, who was known as a cultivation genius in Kargath Academy, feel a burst of humiliation in his heart. He didn't expect that a freshman who had just entered the school would ride on his head. This made him resent Jianchen in his heart. Although there was still Tai Ta was the dean's disciple. Even if Qing Mingxiang had a powerful background, he did not dare to casually offend the dean. The old man in charge of the assessment took a deep breath and did his best to calm himself down. He looked deeply at Jianchen and smiled. Changyang Shoten, you have really shocked me. I didn't expect that you would be able to obtain so many second-rank monster cores with your strength not even at the Saint Realm. This has already surpassed the current number 1 in terms of monster cores, Bugadier. It seems that the first place this time will belong to none other than you. After saying that, the old man handed over the space belt that belonged to Jianchen and a medal of honor to him. Jianchen chuckled and took the items from the old man. He said, "Teacher, you're exaggerating. It's still hard to say who the first place will belong to. After all, there is still Tai Ta behind me. He has no less monster cores than me." After saying that, Jianchen took out all the monster cores from his space belt. Hearing Jianchen's words, the old man looked meaningfully at Jianchen and smiled, but did not say anything. After Jianchen put away all the second-rank monster cores on the table into his space belt, he directly walked off the platform. After that, Iron Tower came to the desk and took out all the Tier 2 monster cores from his spatial belt. After all, Tai Ta had entered the 3rd region with Jianchen, so the monster cores he obtained were equally distributed. As a result, the number of monster cores in his space belt was almost the same as Jianchen's. In the end, the old man in charge of the assessment counted that Tai Ta had a total of 127 second-rank monster cores, which was only 1 less than Jianchen's. When the old man in charge of the assessment announced that Tai Ta had a total of 2 rank monster cores, all the teachers and students were shocked speechless once again. Below the platform, Jing Mingyue, who was ranked 5th on the list of top 10 experts of Kargath Academy, stood there in a daze. Her eyes seemed a little absent-minded. She was originally ranked 2nd, but now she had been pushed down by 2 new students who had suddenly appeared. This result was a little unacceptable to her. After all, She had spent a lot of effort to obtain those monster cores. She really could not imagine how two new students who had just entered the academy this year and had not even reached Saint Realm had obtained so many monster cores. At this moment, a very beautiful girl came up to Jing Mingyue and intimately hugged her waist. She chuckled, "Sister Jing, you didn't expect that, right? You were originally ranked second, but you were actually pushed down by two new students this year." Hearing that, Jing Mingyue sighed and said with a bitter smile, "I really didn't expect that two new students who have not even reached Saint Realm would have so many monster cores. Even the number one expert of our Kargath Academy, Brigadier, was forcefully pushed down to third place. I really don't know how they obtained the monster cores in their hands. Could it be that they really brought them in from outside?" Hearing this, the young woman chuckled and said, "Big Sister Jing, you've guessed wrongly. I believe that they obtained those Class 2 monster cores with their own strength, and they didn't bring them in from the outside like you've imagined." The girl's words stunned Jing Mingyue. She immediately turned her head and looked at the girl with a puzzled expression. She asked curiously, "Xiao Lu, why do you say that?" The girl smiled mysteriously and a trace of pride appeared on her face. Then she lowered her voice and said, "Sister Jing, I met the two of them in the second region and stayed with them for a day. You mustn't underestimate them. They are very powerful, especially that Changyang Shoten. He used a broken iron rod to kill rank 1 magical beasts in one strike several times. He directly pierced through the throats of magical beasts." "Really?" Jing Mingyue's eyes revealed a trace of surprise. She clearly didn't believe it. "Of course, I saw it with my own eyes. It can't be fake." The young girl puffed out her chest and said with certainty, "Also, that night, we were attacked by more than 20 green wolves. The two of them killed all of them without much effort." "What? You're saying that the two of them killed all of the green wolves?" Hearing this, Jing Mingyue could no longer maintain her composure, and a trace of horror appeared on her face. Although her strength had reached the high-level Saint Realm, she could only flee in the face of more than 20 level 1 magical beasts, let alone kill them. The girl nodded firmly and said, "Yes, Sister Jing. I saw it with my own eyes. Although Changyang Shoten and Taida haven't condensed a saint weapon yet, they're no weaker than saints. That's why I'm certain that they didn't bring the monster cores in from outside." Hearing that, Jing Mingyue lowered her head and pondered. She didn't show any dissatisfaction at being pushed out of the top 3 by Jianshan and Taita. From this, it could be seen that Jing Mingyue wasn't a narrow-minded person. After the examination of the monster cores was completed, the award ceremony was held immediately. The top 3 rankers in terms of the number of Tier 1 and Tier 2 monster cores obtained in this event would receive the same rewards. The first ranker would be rewarded with a Tier 4 monster core and an honor badge made entirely of purple gold. The second and third rankers would be rewarded with a Tier 3 monster core and an honor badge made entirely of gold. Although these medals weren't worth much, the significance they represented was extraordinary. As a result, even the disciples of nobles with some backing were extremely envious of these medals of honor. As for Jianshan and Taita, they were ranked first and second in terms of the amount of Class 1 and Class 2 monster cores they obtained. Therefore, the two of them received double rewards. The third in terms of Class 1 monster cores was still Mu Tian, while the third in terms of Class 2 monster cores was the top of the Kargath Academy's 10 great experts ranking, Brigadier. Chapter 53. When the award ceremony was over, the thousands of students on the field left in the blink of an eye. Almost all of the students had suffered injuries of varying degrees after fighting with the magical beasts in the forest for the past 3 days. Now that the award ceremony was over, everyone returned to their respective dormitories to recuperate. Those who remained on the field were mostly the students who had given up on their missions in advance and were in good condition. However, after experiencing this incident, Jianshan and Taita's reputation in Kargath Academy suddenly rose to the peak. They had become the biggest celebrities in Kargath Academy. Almost everywhere, one could hear the topic of the two of them. After the award ceremony ended, Jianshan, Taita, and big brother Changyang, who hurriedly bid farewell and returned to their dormitories to recuperate from their injuries. At the center of the academy, there was a tower that occupied an area of 100 meters. At the top of the tower, Vice Principal Bai En was standing in the middle of the room with a respectful expression. In front of him, the Dean of Kargath Academy was leisurely sitting in front of his desk with a faint smile on his face. That pair of deep eyes actually carried traces of happiness and excitement. Bai En, it seems that a genius has appeared in our Kargath Academy this time. The Dean's face was filled with a happy smile. His tone was full of excitement. Vice Principal Bai En nodded and said with a smile, "Dean, you are wrong. This time, our Kargath Academy didn't only have one genius, but two. They are respectively Changyang Shoten and Taita." Hearing this, the Dean slightly shook his head and said with a smile, "That's right, Taita's talent is indeed very high. Moreover, he has the advantage of being born with divine strength. But compared to Changyang Shoten, the difference is too big." Hearing this, Vice Principal Bai En's face showed a trace of surprise. He doubtfully said, "Dean, why do you say so?" The Dean let out a long sigh and said, "Don't underestimate Changyang Shoten. He's not a simple person. No wonder old man Chang from Changyang Prefecture kept praising him. Actually, when I received news that Changyang Shoten and Taita had killed a Class 2 magical beast in the 3rd area yesterday afternoon, I had already rushed over and secretly observed the two of them. Although the two of them haven't advanced to saint level yet, their battle prowess can't be underestimated, especially Changyang Shoten. With a broken iron rod, he is almost invincible in the 3rd area. Not only is his attack speed extremely fast, but it is also very accurate. His battle experience is so rich that it doesn't seem like a 15-year-old boy at all, but more like a person who has experienced hundreds of battles. Almost all of the Class 2 monster cores that died at their hands were killed by Changyang Shoten alone. Iron Tower only played a role as a distraction. Hearing this, Vice Principal Bai En's face was filled with disbelief. He said, "Dean, is Changyang Shoten really as powerful as you say?" The Dean nodded and said, "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed that a 15-year-old boy could be so powerful. The most important thing is his rich battle experience and fighting skills. This isn't something that can be learned just because you want to. It's impossible to grasp these things without going through hundreds of battles. No wonder old man Chang kept praising Changyang Shoten. He really is very talented. It seems that old man Chang taught him these things." Hearing this, Vice Principal Bai En's face showed a trace of relief. He said, "With Master Chang Wuji's guidance, it'll be difficult for Changyang Shoten not to make a name for himself in the future." The Dean nodded slightly and said, "Although he has old man Chang's guidance, if he doesn't have extraordinary talent, he won't be able to learn anything even with old man Chang's guidance. If Changyang Shoten wasn't the 4th young master of Changyang Prefecture, I would have accepted him as my disciple. After all, such a genius is rare. If he can grow up in the future, it'll be a blessing for the kingdom of Jessen." After the award ceremony, Jianshin received a new set of uniform and went to take a bath. He washed off all the dirt on his body from the past few days in the forest. He then put on the brand new uniform and returned to his dorm room feeling refreshed. Although he had been fighting for the past 3 days in the forest, Jianshin did not show any signs of fatigue. In his previous life, Jianshin had experienced crueler things than this. After returning to his dorm room, Jianshin sat cross-legged on his bed. He held a Class 1 monster core in each hand and began to cultivate. Although Jianshin's strength had reached the pinnacle of the 10th stage of Saint Force, he could clearly feel that the Saint Force in his body had not yet reached a state of saturation. As the energy within the monster cores was continuously absorbed by Jianshin, the Saint Force in Jianshin's body also grew at a rapid rate. The speed of his cultivation was 10 times faster than when he absorbed the Yuan Qi of the world. In the following 3 days, other than eating, Jianshin spent all his time cultivating in his dorm room. After 3 days of cultivation, the Saint Force in his body had reached a state of saturation. At this moment, no matter how much energy Jianshin absorbed from the monster cores, the Saint Force in his body would not continue to grow. Jianshin knew that he should break through to the Saint realm now and condense a Saint weapon. Otherwise, the Saint force in his body would forever stagnate. Jianshin had already understood the steps and methods to condense a Saint weapon and become a Saint from the Academy's library. It was to use one's will to condense all the Saint force in one's body and slowly form a weapon. Finally, it would fuse with one's spirit and perfectly fuse together. Once all the Saint force in one's body had condensed into a weapon, one would officially become a Saint realm expert. Jianshin did not stop for even a moment. He took out a Class 4 monster core from his space belt in case he needed it. He then immediately began to prepare to condense a Saint weapon and break through to the Saint realm. The Saint force in Jianshin's Dantian was firmly controlled by his powerful spirit. In front of his powerful spirit, Jianshin had absolute control over the Saint force in his Dantian. With a thought, Jianshin slowly gathered all the Saint force in his Dantian, slowly forming the shape of a sword. Finally, he began to compress it slowly. Jianshin's powerful spirit had been brought over from his previous life. It was far more powerful than ordinary people when it was born. Before his powerful spirit, the relatively weak Saint force in his body could not resist at all. It was completely suppressed by Jianshin's powerful spirit. Afterward, it began to compress according to the shape of the sword formed by the Saint force. As the Saint force was constantly compressed, the Saint force that filled Jianshin's Dantian rapidly decreased. Although this was the case, the Saint force in his Dantian was constantly increasing in strength. The sword formed from Saint force gradually became clearer. In the end, it became an extremely small sword in his Dantian. At the same time, Jianshin also began to absorb the Saint force. Although Jianshin had successfully condensed all the Saint force in his Dantian into a sword, it did not mean that he had reached Saint realm. There was still one final step, which was also the most difficult step. It was this step that prevented many people from reaching Saint realm in their entire lives. The final step was to fuse a part of his spirit into the sword formed from Saint force in his Dantian and establish a mental connection with it. At the same time, he had to completely fuse the strand of spirit with the Saint weapon in his Dantian. This step seemed simple, but it was actually extremely difficult. Although this step was extremely difficult in the eyes of ordinary people, it was nothing difficult for Jianshin, who was extremely powerful and could use it as he pleased. Jianshin directly fused a strand of his spirit into the Saint weapon in his Dantian. Afterward, under his skilled control, the strand of spirit connected with the Saint weapon very quickly. In the end, it completely fused with the Saint weapon, no longer separating them. At this moment, Jianshin had truly become a true saint. The hurdle of reaching Saint realm posed no obstruction to him at all. When Jianshin's strand of spirit fused with the Saint weapon in his Dantian, Jianshin suddenly experienced a strange feeling. It was as if the sword completely condensed from Saint force in his Dantian had become a part of him. Not only could he control it as he wished, but he could also clearly sense every part of the sword's structure. Right now, there was no longer any Saint force in Jianshin's Dantian. There was only a sword completely condensed from Saint force in his Dantian, acting as a source of energy. The sword seemed extremely small. In terms of thickness and length, it was no different from an embroidery needle. Now that the Saint weapon had been condensed, Jianshin could clearly sense that the pulses of energy from the Saint weapon were several times more powerful than before. Without any exaggeration, a person who had reached Saint realm could easily defeat someone at the peak of the 10th layer of Saint force in an open battle. Unless something unexpected happened or something special happened, it was impossible for someone at the peak of the 10th layer of Saint force to defeat a Saint realm expert. However, between Jianshin and Tai Ta, one was powerful. Tai Ta was born with great strength and his body was extremely tough. Even Jianshin, who had been refining his body with Saint force since he was young, was no match for him. His abnormal strength and powerful defense were enough to make up for the lack of Saint force. Unless the difference in strength was too great, he would not be Tai Ta's opponent at all. At most, they would be able to fight to a draw. Although Jianshin was able to defeat an intermediate Saint realm expert at the peak of the 10th layer of Saint force, It was all because of the experience and battle techniques he had brought from his previous life. Jianxin's swift sword techniques and his attainments in the way of the sword, as well as the battle intent he had tempered through many life and death battles in his previous life, were enough to make him an invincible existence among those at the same level as him. Challenging those at a higher level was nothing to him. At this moment, Jianxin's expression suddenly changed. Following that, his dantian began to tremble violently. His entire dantian began to fluctuate in an unstable state. As soon as the fluctuations began, before Jianxin could react, the surrounding yuan qi began to surge wildly. All the yuan qi in a radius of several kilometers seemed to be affected by an invisible suction force, rushing to gather in Jianxin's direction. At this moment, Jianxin's body seemed to have escaped his control. All the pores on his body suddenly opened up, wildly absorbing the dense yuan qi in the surroundings. The energy within the Class 4 monster core in Jianxin's hand began to leak out at an extremely terrifying speed. In the end, it formed a visible energy ribbon that flowed into Jianxin's body. Chapter 54. Jianxin had no idea what was happening to his body. He had already lost control of his body and was unable to stop his body from absorbing the surrounding spiritual energy. Even with Jianxin's steel-like willpower, he could not help but feel a wave of panic when he sensed the terrifying speed at which his body was absorbing the external spiritual energy. If his body continued to absorb the spiritual energy of the world at such a speed, it would not take long before he would explode from the powerful spiritual energy. Furthermore, what made Jianxin the most puzzled was that he had no idea what was going on. Why would his dantian automatically absorb the spiritual energy of the world for no reason? Furthermore, the terrifying speed of absorption made Jianxin feel a wave of shock. With Jianxin as the center, the spiritual energy of the world within a radius of several kilometers rapidly gathered towards Jianxin. The surging spiritual energy of the world had already formed a gust of wind that whistled wildly within Kargath Academy, causing the fallen leaves to flutter and sand to fly. However, when such a large amount of spiritual energy of the world entered Jianxin's dantian, it disappeared like a stone sinking into the ocean. What Jianxin was worried about did not happen. Seeing this, Jianxin finally let out a sigh of relief. Although he did not know what had happened to his dantian, it was fine as long as he did not explode from the spiritual energy of the world. At the same time, at the top of the tower in the center of the academy, the expression of the dean of Kargath Academy changed slightly. He exclaimed, "What's going on? Why is the spiritual energy of the world fluctuating so violently?" As soon as he finished speaking, the dean's body turned into a blur as he directly leapt out of the window at the top of the tower. He flew through the air at a terrifying speed and arrived in front of Jianxin's dormitory in a short moment. He stared in the direction of Jianxin's dormitory with a grave expression. There was also some doubt and confusion mixed within. At this moment, a white figure shot over from the distance at an extremely fast speed. In less than a breath of time, it had crossed several hundred meters and appeared behind the dean. It was a middle-aged man in white robes. He was the vice dean Bai En. Not long after Bai En sensed them, dozens of figures quickly ran over from afar. However, they all eventually stopped quietly behind Vice Principal Bai En. Their gazes were all focused on the place where the yuan qi of heaven and earth was concentrated. They were all teachers of the academy and were not weak. At such a close distance, such a powerful fluctuation of the spiritual energy of the world naturally could not escape their notice. Bai En stared at the spot where the yuan qi of heaven and earth was gathered in surprise. His face was filled with confusion as he asked, "Dean, what's going on? Why is the yuan qi of heaven and earth in a radius of several kilometers gathering here?" Although the dean's face's expression, his face still was filled with confusion. "I have no idea what's happening here. Let's go take a look." With that said, the dean took the lead and walked into the dormitory, while Vice Dean Bai En followed behind. "All of you stay here. No one is allowed to enter." Just as the group of teachers behind him was about to follow in, the dean's voice suddenly rang out. Hearing this, All the teachers simultaneously stopped in their tracks and obediently stood where they were. None of them dared to disobey the dean's orders. Very soon, the dean and vice-dean arrived at the place where the spiritual energy of the world was concentrated. It was outside Jianxin's dormitory. Bai En gently slammed his hand against the door. Without a sound, the door to Jianxin's dormitory shattered. As the door shattered, the scene in the dormitory entered their eyes. They saw Jianxin cultivating on his bed with his eyes closed. The tremendous amount of spiritual energy in the surroundings was absorbed into his body at an extremely terrifying rate, causing a hazy, blurry mist to form around him. Seeing this, the principal and vice principal of Kargath Academy were shocked speechless. No matter what, they would never have thought that the reason why the world energy fluctuated so much was because of a single person cultivating. What made them even more shocked was that Jianxin's speed of absorbing the yuan qi of heaven and earth had already reached a shocking level. It's actually Changyang Shoten. How is this possible? How can he cause such a great effect with his strength? Vice Dean Bai En was shocked as if he had seen the most unbelievable scene in the world. The dean's face was also filled with shock. His bright and deep eyes stared straight at Jianxin. After a long while, he finally let out a long sigh and said, "This child is extraordinary." Vice Dean Bai En nodded when he heard that. He completely agreed with the dean's words. In fact, he had already thought that Jianxin was extraordinary. "Dean, what should we do now?" Vice Dean Bai En asked. "Wait." The dean opened his mouth slightly and only said a single word. Afterwards, the dean and vice dean of Kargath Academy quietly stood outside Jianxin's room, waiting for Jianxin to wake up. The two of them didn't enter the room, nor did they make any noise. They were afraid of disturbing Jianxin, who was immersed in cultivation. Jianxin was very clear about what was happening outside the dormitory. However, he couldn't move or speak at this moment. He already couldn't control his body at all. The rank 4 monster core in his hand that was originally the size of a fist was shrinking at a speed visible to the naked eye with the loss of energy. It had already become the size of a ping-pong ball. All the energy and the large amount of spiritual energy absorbed from the outside world had disappeared into Jianxin's dantian. It was like a stone sinking into the sea, without any splashes. Regarding the situation in his dantian, Jianxin was very puzzled. He didn't understand where all the spiritual energy of the world had gone to. Gradually, with the passage of time, the energy from the Class 4 monster core in Jianxin's hand had been completely absorbed. In his dantian, there was finally a change. 2 dots of light, 1 purple and 1 green, gradually appeared in his dantian. The moment these 2 dots of light appeared, the speed at which Jianxin's dantian absorbed the yuan qi of heaven and earth suddenly increased to an abnormally terrifying speed. At this moment, it wasn't just the spiritual qi within a radius of several kilometers that was affected. When the 2 dots of light appeared in Jianxin's dantian, the yuan qi of heaven and earth within a radius of several kilometers was affected. It surged towards Jianxin's dantian and entered his body through his pores, being absorbed by the 2 dots of light in his dantian. Due to the increase in the speed at which he absorbed the spiritual energy of the world, Jianxin's body had already formed a faint white mist that could be seen with the naked eye. Within the white mist, Jianxin's body was faintly discernible, giving him an even more mysterious feeling. The increase in the spiritual energy of the world was immediately noticed by the principal and vice principal, who were still waiting outside the door. The two of them looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. Right now, the entire Kargath Academy was filled with a gale because of the spiritual energy of the world. However, other than the teachers, all the students treated this gale as a normal gale and didn't affect them in the slightest. The absorption of the spiritual energy of the world in Jianxin's dantian continued for half a day before it stopped. Right now, all the spiritual energy within a dozen kilometers had almost been completely absorbed by Jianxin. Right now, other than a sword completely condensed from Saint Force in Jianxin's dantian, there were 2 additional specks of light, 1 purple and 1 green. The specks of light were extremely small and weak. They flickered as if they could be extinguished at any moment. Feeling the sudden appearance of the 2 specks of light in his dantian, Genshin's heart immediately sank. This was the first time he had encountered an uncontrollable situation in his dantian. It was also something he was extremely unwilling to encounter. However, he was certain that the two specks of light had something to do with the uncontrollable absorption of the spiritual energy of the world. Could it be that these two specks of light were formed from the spiritual energy of the world just now? Genshin guessed inwardly. The huge amount of spiritual energy of the world that had entered his dantian had disappeared like a stone sinking into the ocean. This was an extremely inconceivable matter. However, after absorbing the huge amount of spiritual energy of the world, two specks of light had mysteriously appeared in his dantian. This made it very easy for Genshin to connect the dots. However, what made Genshin feel puzzled and uneasy was the two specks of light that had mysteriously appeared in his dantian. What was their use? Would their existence cause any adverse effects to him in the future? These were the questions that Genshin was most worried about at the moment. Especially the latter, which made Genshin feel a sense of insecurity. After hesitating for a while in his heart, Genshin finally tried to control the two specks of light. However, after a series of attempts, his heart became heavier and heavier. Although he could clearly see the two specks of light through his inner vision, once he tried to control them, he suddenly realized that the two specks of light in his dantian were like illusions. He could easily pass through them without being able to control them at all. It was as if they did not exist at all. The dantian was an extremely important place for every cultivator. Genshin did not wish to see his dantian appear in a situation that he could not control. Otherwise, it might bring about fatal consequences at a critical moment. Forget it. If it's a blessing, it's not a curse. If it's a curse, it can't be avoided. Anyway, I've already died once. Why should I care so much? Very soon, Genshin thought it through and no longer worried about the changes in his dantian. Since the situation was not something he could control, he could only accept it calmly. Genshin slowly opened his eyes. His gaze was calm. Although successfully advancing to the saint stage was something to be happy about, he could not be happy because of the situation in his dantian that he could not control. Just as Genshin opened his eyes, the dean and vice dean, by N, who had been waiting outside, walked in at the same time. Seeing the dean walk in, Genshin hurriedly got off the bed and bowed. "Dean, vice dean." The dean's old face was full of smiles. He looked at Genshin calmly and smiled. "Xianxia, there was an abnormality in the energy of the world here just now. Have you encountered any problems with your cultivation? If you have, you might as well tell me and see if I can help you solve it." The dean's voice carried some concern. Chapter 55. The dean chuckled and continued, "Xianxia, you've already advanced to the saint realm, haven't you?" Genshin nodded slightly and said, "Yes, I've just successfully condensed a holy weapon." "Then I wonder if your current strength is at the advanced or intermediate level of the saint realm." The dean smiled. In his opinion, Genshin's current strength should be at least at the intermediate level of the saint realm. After all, he had seen with his own eyes that Genshin had absorbed a huge amount of chi of heaven and earth just now. Although he did not know how Genshin had digested such a huge amount of chi of heaven and earth, he understood that Genshin's strength would definitely not stop at the primary level after absorbing so much chi of heaven and earth. As soon as he advanced to the saint realm, he directly skipped the primary level and became at least an intermediate level saint. At the thought of this, the dean could not help but feel a burst of joy in his heart. This time, a real genius had finally walked out of his Kargath Academy. "Dean, I've just successfully condensed a holy weapon. Of course, my current strength is still at the primary level." Genshin knew that the dean at most thought that he had absorbed a huge amount of chi of heaven and earth just now, so he asked this question. Primary level. Hearing this, not only the dean, but even the deputy dean, by N, who was standing silently beside him, had a face full of disbelief. "How is it possible? You've absorbed such a huge amount of chi of heaven and earth. How can your strength still be at the primary level?" Bayan could not help but ask. Even the dean was full of doubts. "I don't know either." Genshin smiled bitterly. He did not intend to tell them what had happened in his dantian. Alright, since Changyang Xianxia is fine, it's time for us to leave. The dean looked at Jianchen and said, Changyang Shoten, now that you've just advanced to the Saint Realm, you should familiarize yourself with the use of the holy weapon. With that, the dean and the deputy dean left Jianchen's room. After leaving the dormitory building, the deputy dean, by N, asked curiously, Dean, Changyang Shoten has clearly absorbed such a huge amount of qi of heaven and earth. How can his strength still be at the primary level of the Saint Realm? This doesn't seem to make sense. Hearing this, the dean nodded slightly and said, Yes, it does. Perhaps there's some secret on Changyang Shoten that we don't know. Otherwise, how can he draw the qi of heaven and earth within a radius of 12 miles? This is an impossible thing. Then, the dean paused and continued. From now on, as long as it's not too big a problem, we shouldn't interfere. Let's let him grow on his own. Let's let him grow by himself. Let's not, let's him, teet. Estings he, yes, by N understands. Bye. The vice dean replied respectfully. He knew that it was worth it for the Kargath Academy to raise a genius. The dean gazed at the blue sky and murmured, Changyang Shoten seems to be only 15 this year. A 15-year-old saint is enough to shock the Tianyuan continent. Looks like Changyang Prefecture has really produced a genius this time. I hope he'll be able to walk on smoothly. He can't die prematurely, or it'll be a loss to the kingdom of Jessen. Sigh, it's a pity that the Changyang ancestor has already disappeared for 100 years. If he were still alive, he would have probably succeeded already. After the dean left, Jianchen sat back down on his bed and observed the 2 specks of light that had suddenly appeared in his dantian. In the end, he sighed helplessly. Jianchen had no idea what was going on with the 2 specks of light. Although they were in his dantian, they were completely out of his control. Jianchen sighed inwardly. He had already decided to ignore them, because it was a complete waste of time. After all, he had already died once, so he was able to accept many things. In this life, other than by Yuntian, who had given him his first taste of motherly love, there was nothing else that he cared about. Jianchen took a few deep breaths and slowly calmed down. Afterward, he extended his right hand. With a thought, a powerful pulse of energy flashed and a slender sword appeared in Jianchen's right hand. The sword was very small, and its entire body was silvery white. It was like a mirror that could clearly reflect the surrounding scenery. The sword was 4 feet long and 2 fingers wide. On the surface of the sword near the hilt, there were 2 words, light wind. The shape of the sword was completely based on the sword that Jianchen had used in his previous life. As for the name, it was the same as the sword he had used in his previous life. It was called Light Wind Sword. Jianchen's swordsmanship focused on the word fast. His swordsmanship was light and agile, and could change into thousands of forms. It was like a gentle breeze that came and went without a trace, making it impossible to catch. Thus, it was called Light Wind Sword. Holding the Light Wind Sword, Jianchen couldn't help but smile. Especially when he held the Light Wind Sword, he felt as if he had returned to his previous life. The only difference was that at this moment, Jianchen felt as if the sword in his hand was like an extension of his arm. He didn't need to use too much strength to control it. Moreover, Jianchen could clearly feel that his spirit was perfectly connected with the sword in his hand. It was as if the two were one and no longer separated. This was a feeling that he had never felt before in his previous life. Jianchen extended his finger and lightly flicked the shiny silver sword. Ding! Following a crisp sound, the light wind sword let out a crisp sound. From the looks of it, the light wind sword looked like it was forged from fine iron. Jianchen was filled with joy as he used his left hand to gently stroke the light wind sword. Looking at it, it was as if the sword was his most beloved person. For a true swordsman, their love for the sword was something that could not be replaced by anything else. The sword was their life and their soul. In his previous life, Jianchen was such a person. When Jianchen summoned the light wind sword, the saint weapon that was entrenched in his dantian disappeared. At this moment, all of his strength was concentrated on the sword in his hand. Not only could this sword display a powerful attack, it was also the source of Jianxin's strength. It would replace Jianxin's dantian and provide him with an endless supply of energy. With a thought, the light wind sword in Jianxin's hand disappeared and a smaller version of the light wind sword appeared in his dantian. In the blink of an eye, 2 days had passed since Jianxin had successfully become a saint. In these 2 days, other than occasionally observing the purple and green lights in his dantian, Jianxin spent the rest of his time in the academy's library. He hoped that he would be able to find something related to his dantian from the books, but unfortunately, he was unable to find anything. In these 2 days, the news of Jianxin becoming a saint spread throughout the academy, causing another wave. This was because Jianxin had become a saint too quickly. Everyone in the Kargath Academy knew that when Jianxin had just entered the academy a few months ago, his strength was only at the 8th layer of saint force. But in just a few short months, Jianxin had broken through from 80% saint force to a saint. Such a fast cultivation speed made everyone in the Kargath Academy gasp in surprise. This speed had completely surpassed the cultivation genius of the Kargath Academy, Chengmingxiang. Far away from the Kargath Academy, in a dazzling palace, a middle-aged man in a purple and gold robe was sitting in the study, reading a book. "Your Majesty, there is a messenger requesting an audience." At this moment, a deep and respectful voice sounded from outside the door. Hearing this, the middle-aged man's gaze slowly moved away from the book and looked towards the door. He said in an indifferent tone, "Come in." This middle-aged man was the ruler of the kingdom of Jessen, Kardsun. As soon as the king's voice fell, the door of the study was gently opened. A young man in a black robe who looked to be around 30 years old quickly walked in. When he was 30 steps away from the king, he suddenly stopped and knelt on one knee. He said in a respectful tone, "Your Majesty, this is a letter from the Dean of the Kargath Academy, Lord Kafir." At first, the king didn't seem to care, but when he heard the name of the Dean of the Kargath Academy, Kafir's name, his expression immediately became serious. He slowly placed the book in his hand on the table and said, "Quickly present it." "Your Majesty!" Standing beside the king, a personal guard in armor respectfully responded. He immediately took the letter from the messenger and carefully checked it in his hand. After confirming that there were no problems, he walked forward and handed it to the king. The king immediately opened the letter and read it. Then, a smile gradually appeared on his calm face as he muttered, "This Changyang Shoten is truly a genius. Not only can he defeat a saint with only the 8th level of saint force, he can also defeat a mid-level saint with only the 10th level of saint force. Moreover, he can condense a saint weapon and become a saint at the age of 15. He truly is a genius. No wonder Royal Uncle praised him so much. With Royal Uncle's eyesight, there's naturally no problem with judging people. Since Royal Uncle has recommended Changyang Shoten, then I should do something." Changyang Shoten has Changyang Prefecture behind him, and he's also the 4th young master of Changyang Prefecture. It seems that it's impossible to control him. Since that's the case, I can only try my best to rope him in. Although Changyang Prefecture has been silent for decades, their family background is still there. Their strength cannot be underestimated. It's enough for me to do this. Since that's the case, let's do it this way." At this point, the king seemed to have decided on something. He immediately said, "Men, bring me a brush and ink." Soon, the servant prepared the brush and ink. His Majesty picked up the brush and began to write. Finally, he carefully read the words that he had written. Then, he slowly folded it and left the study room. The king held the written scroll in one hand and was escorted by a group of bodyguards. He passed through many halls in the palace and finally entered a beautiful courtyard. Just as the king stepped into the courtyard, an old man who looked to be in his 50s or 60s walked out of a room in the courtyard. He looked at the king calmly and smiled, "So it's your Majesty. Please come in." The king came before the old man. He did not enter the room. He handed the scroll in his hand to the old man and said in a serious tone, "Senior Yiming, I have an important letter that I need you to personally deliver to Changyang Prefecture in Lore City." Hearing this, The old man's expression became slightly serious. He reached out to take the scroll in the king's hand and said, "Don't worry, Your Majesty. I will definitely deliver the letter." The old man knew that since it was a letter that required him to personally deliver, it was definitely not that simple. Chapter 56. The next morning, Xianxia, who was sitting cross-legged on the bed, slowly opened his eyes. In the past 2 days, he didn't cultivate. Apart from going to the library to read books during the day, he spent the night in the dormitory familiarizing himself with the usage of the holy weapon in his dantian. He wanted to be able to use the holy weapon freely in the shortest time possible. After all, although Xianxia had advanced to a saint and the holy weapon in his body was connected to his mind, it was still not enough for him to perfectly grasp and use the holy weapon. For Xianxia, who had the experience of his previous life, the holy weapon in this world was still fresh in his heart. Without spending a few days to familiarize himself with it and accept it, even if the holy weapon in his body was connected to his mind, it would be difficult for Xianxia to exert his peak strength. This was because it was equivalent to a person who had lost an arm for more than 10 years, but the arm suddenly grew back. Anyone who was already familiar with the life of losing an arm would feel a little uncomfortable when faced with a new arm. This required time to slowly accept and familiarize himself with it. Slowly standing up from the bed, Xianxia directly left the dormitory. After going to the cafeteria for breakfast, Xianxia went to the library as usual. Although the library was now open, there was no one inside except for a middle-aged woman who was cleaning. Xianxia looked at the empty library, then went directly to the 5th floor of the library. After reading these days, almost all the books that interested Xianxia in the first 4 floors of the library had been read by him. The library had a total of 7 floors. The first 2 floors were open to students below the Saint Realm, the 3rd and 4th floors were open to students who had reached the Saint Realm, and the 5th floor was not open to the public. Only the teachers of the academy could read the books on the 5th floor. As for the 6th and 7th floor, there was a powerful barrier guarding the entrance. Only the principal and vice principal were allowed to enter. If anyone else wanted to enter the 7th floor, they would have to obtain the approval of the principal of Kargath Academy. Although the 5th floor of the library was not open to students, Xianxia's first place in the freshman martial arts competition was enough for him to enter the 5th floor of the library at will. The 5th floor of the library was not big, and there were not many books inside. In total, there were only 100 books, which was incomparable to the thousands of books on the 1st floor. However, Xianxia knew that any one of these books was much more valuable than all the books he had read before. The library on the 5th floor was extremely quiet. Although there weren't many people here, Xianxia could tell that this place had been cleaned frequently. The entire room was spotless, without a single speck of dust. Xianxia walked to the bookshelf and picked a book that talked about cultivation. The content of this book was completely about cultivation. Although Xianxia didn't know if the things inside would be helpful to him, at least it could enrich his knowledge in this area. Xianxia was very engrossed in reading. He was simply intoxicated. Although the content recorded in this book was of little help to Xianxia, it was an eye-opener for him. It was as if he had seen a completely different world of cultivation. These things were something he had never thought of in his previous life. This book was not thick, only a few dozen pages. Xianxia finished reading it quickly. After reading it, Xianxia put down the book and lowered his head to ponder for a while, digesting and memorizing the new things in his mind. After carefully putting the book back in its original place, Xianxia picked up another book and began reading. In the 5th floor of the library, almost all of the books were left behind by predecessors and some cultivation methods. However, among these cultivation methods, the highest rank was only Earth rank. Time quietly passed. Xianxia stayed in the 5th floor of the library and read one book after another, completely forgetting the time. At this time, Xianxia wasn't the only one on the 5th floor. There were 2 more middle-aged men. With a glance, one could tell that they were teachers of Kargath Academy. The 2 middle-aged men obviously recognized Xianxia. When they saw Xianxia for the first time, their eyes showed a trace of surprise, but they didn't say anything to disturb him. At this time, An old man wearing a luxurious green robe walked up from below. The old man looked to be in his 50s or 60s. He had white hair and a youthful face. A pair of deep eyes flashed from time to time. The 5th floor of the library wasn't big. After the old man entered the 5th floor of the library, he was about to walk to the 6th floor from the side of the stairs when he inadvertently caught sight of a slightly thin figure from the corner of his eyes. The old man's body slightly paused and he stopped in his tracks. He looked at the back of the figure and then with a smile on his face, he slowly walked to the back of the slightly thin figure in the school uniform and said, "Changyang Shoten." Hearing this, Jianchen suddenly woke up. When he turned around and saw the old man standing behind him, his face was slightly stunned. He immediately stood up and smiled. "Dean, why are you here?" This old man was the dean of Kargath Academy. The dean's voice also woke up the 2 reading teachers. When the 2 middle-aged men saw that it was the dean, they were shocked. They immediately put down the books in their hands and stood up from their chairs. They slightly cupped their hands towards the dean and said, "Greetings, Dean." Their tone was filled with respect from the bottom of their hearts. The dean of Kargath Academy was a well-known figure in the entire kingdom of Jessen. This was because not only was he a powerful Heaven Saint Master, but he was also one of the 6 strongest experts in the kingdom of Jessen. Even in the Tianyuan continent, a Heaven Saint Master was a powerful figure who could do whatever he wanted. The dean's gaze lightly swept across the 2 middle-aged men. He waved his hand and said, "Don't mind me. Both of you continue reading your books." "Yes, Dean." The 2 middle-aged men immediately sat back down obediently. However, they were no longer able to focus on the books in their hands. The dean glanced at the books in Jianchen's hands and nodded with a smile. His eyes were filled with gratification as he said, "Changyang Shoten, do you also like reading these books?" Jianchen nodded without hesitation and said, "That's right. You can learn a lot from these books. Even if they aren't of any help to you, they can still broaden your horizons." Hearing this, the dean looked at Jianchen with admiration. "Very good, very good. Changyang Shoten, it's really rare for you to understand this. Since you like reading these books, I'll help you this time. Come with me." With that, the dean turned around and walked towards the stairs leading to the 6th floor. Looking in the direction the dean walked, how could Jianchen not understand what the dean meant? He was immediately overjoyed. He hurriedly placed the book in his hands back to its original position and followed the dean to the 6th floor. Seeing Jianchen disappear at the stairs, the 2 teachers' eyes were filled with envy. Only the dean and vice-dean had the authority to enter the 6th and 7th floor of the library. If anyone else wanted to enter, they would have to obtain the dean's personal approval. The 6th and 7th floor of the library was definitely the place that all the teachers in the Kargath Academy yearned for the most. This was because not only were there records of higher-level cultivation methods, there were also many other books that were much richer and of a much higher level. Most importantly, the 6th and 7th floor of the library recorded many spiritual materials and treasures of the Tianyuan continent. Very soon, Jianchen followed the dean to the entrance of the 6th floor. Here, Jianchen could clearly see a transparent barrier blocking the entrance. The barrier of the 6th and 7th floor was set down by the successive deans. Its defense is extremely strong. Even a Heaven Saint Master would not be able to break through it in a short amount of time. There was a hint of pride in the dean's voice. Then he took out a token made entirely of purple gold. There were very complicated patterns on the token. It looked like a picture. The violet gold token in the dean's hand emitted a faint violet light. The violet light grew brighter and brighter. In the end, a ray of light shot out from the token and directly hit the barrier. The transparent barrier rippled like water, and finally, a large hole that could fit one person slowly appeared in the middle of the barrier. "Changyang Shoten, come with me." The dean called out to Jianchen and directly walked in. Jianchen followed the dean through the 6th floor of the library and directly to the 7th floor. The 7th floor of the library was extremely spacious. It was only the size of a room. In the center of the room was a wooden table. In front of the table was a small bookshelf. On the bookshelf were a dozen books that were not thick. On the bookshelf were 2 boxes. One of the boxes was completely made of extremely precious jade while the other was completely made of violet gold. Both of them were extremely valuable. From this, it could be seen just how valuable the items in the boxes were. Ever since Kargath Academy was founded, this library has existed for several hundred years. In these several hundred years, other than the current dean, there have been quite a few people who have come to the 7th floor of the library. Every single one of them was either a renowned expert of the Tianyuan continent or a person in charge of a large organization. You are the only person who has entered the 7th floor as a student of Kargath Academy. The dean slowly said in an extremely calm voice. Changyang Shoten, the 7th floor of the library is where the wealth of our Kargath Academy resides. The entire 7th floor of the library is enveloped by a powerful barrier. This barrier was set up by the first dean of Kargath Academy, Bunai, using his great strength as a saint ruler. The items inside have all been imprinted with a special imprint. As long as the barrier is not broken, it is impossible to take them out. The books here are either cultivation methods collected by Bunai or his personal notes on cultivation. This is the greatest wealth of our Kargath Academy. Hearing this, Jianshan's expression became serious. He never thought that the 7th floor of the library would be so important. What surprised him even more was that the first dean of Kargath Academy was actually a saint ruler. The dean looked at Jianshan with shining eyes. With a serious expression, he sternly said, Chaoyang Shoten, as the dean, I permit you to look at any book aside from the jade box. You only have one chance, so I hope you will make good use of it. Jianshan solemnly nodded and said, Thank you for your permission, dean. Not only is the contents of the jade box completely useless to you right now, it might even become a hindrance to your growth. As a result, you cannot look at the contents of the jade box. The purple gold box contains a low-level heaven tier cultivation method, the Daoist Heart Sutra. You can read it as you wish. However, the true Yang Qi of your Changyang Prefecture's family heirloom is not much weaker than the Daoist Heart Sutra. As a result, you cannot be impatient as to what kind of cultivation method you want to cultivate. Chapter 57. Jianshan sucked in a deep breath and calmed down very quickly. He slowly walked to the bookshelf and glanced through the books one by one. Afterward, he directly took out the first book and sat down in front of the desk in the center of the bookshelf. This book was about cultivation experiences and techniques for breaking through bottlenecks. It even clearly described the things one needed to pay attention to when breaking through to Earth's Saint Master. Although there were not many books on the first floor, every single one of them was the best of the best. If they were taken outside, it would definitely lead to a storm of blood. Jianshan carefully flipped through the book page by page. He finished the book very quickly. After reading it, Jianshan immediately sank into deep thought. It had to be said that any random book he took out was enough to broaden his horizons. The cultivation system of this world had completely overturned Jianshan's previous life. After reading this book, Jianshan clearly felt that his understanding of the cultivation system of this world had deepened a little. Before long, Jianshan finished reading all the books on the bookshelf. Among the books, half of them described cultivation experiences and the various obstacles one would encounter, while the other half were cultivation methods. However, the highest level cultivation method was only high earth tier. The books that were most helpful to Jianshan were the cultivation experiences and the handwritten notes of the first principal of Kargath Academy, Bunin. Jianshan's gaze landed on the purple gold box at the top of the bookshelf. According to the principal, the purple gold box contained a low heaven tier cultivation method. Although Jianshan did not know just how valuable a low heaven tier cultivation method was, he knew that it was definitely a priceless treasure. After all, heaven tier cultivation methods were ranked second among all the cultivation methods on the Tianyuan continent. They were only one level lower than the saint tier cultivation methods on the Tianyuan continent. Jianshan slowly opened the purple gold box and saw a palm-sized book lying inside. On the cover of the book were the words Daoist Heart Sutra. When Jianshan held the book in his hand, a soft and comfortable feeling immediately filled his hand. There was also a sliver of warmth, as if it had just been touched by someone. The book was made from the fur of a magical beast. It was extremely tough and would not be damaged easily. Xianxia carefully took out the palm-sized book and began to flip through it. His face was stern. Clearly, he understood that it was extremely difficult for him to see such a high-level cultivation method at his current level. Although he did not plan on cultivating the cultivation method, it would be beneficial to him at the very least. He might even be able to learn something valuable from it. For hours later, Xianxia finally shifted his gaze away from the book. He lowered his head and pondered. Only when he was certain that he had completely memorized the contents of the book did he put the book back into the purple gold box and return to his original position. Glancing at the books on the bookshelf again, Xianxia let out a long sigh. He then made his way down the stairs without any reluctance. However, today's trip to the 7th floor of the library was extremely rewarding for Xianxia. Afterwards, Xianxia looked through all the books on the 6th floor. Although the books on the 6th floor were not as valuable as the ones on the 7th floor, they were still quite rewarding for Xianxia, especially the various cultivation experiences left behind by the predecessors. They were extremely helpful to Xianxia. Other than these, Xianxia also learned about many rare spiritual materials and treasures from the books. These were not things that could be found on the lower floors of the library. When Xianxia walked out of the library, the sky had already darkened. Unknowingly, he had already stayed in the library for an entire day. He had even forgotten to eat. Grumble. At this moment, Xianxia's stomach finally grumbled. Xianxia reached out and rubbed his stomach that was already hurting from hunger. His face revealed a trace of a helpless smile. He then walked directly in the direction of the cafeteria. After a hurried dinner, Xianxia walked directly to the dormitory. Along the way, he attracted the gazes of many students. Some were envious, some were admiring, some were jealous. There were all kinds of gazes. Xianxia did not care about the gazes around him. He walked straight to the dormitory. When he entered the dormitory building, he saw a familiar figure standing in front of his dormitory from afar. It was his big brother, Chaosblade. It's already so late, but Big Brother is still waiting for me here. Could it be that there is something urgent that you need me for? Xianxia thought to himself. He quickened his pace and walked over quickly. Big Brother, it's already so late. Why are you still waiting for me here? Can't you wait until tomorrow? Xianxia arrived in front of Chaosblade and asked. When he saw that Xianxia had returned, Chaosblade's face instantly turned bitter. He sighed and said, "Sigh, 4th brother, you're finally back. Where did you run off to today? I practically searched the entire school but couldn't find you. I've been waiting for you here for an entire day." Xianxia's face revealed a trace of apology and said, "Big brother, could it be that you're looking for me for something important?" Hearing this, Chaosblade's face immediately revealed a happy smile. He said excitedly, "Of course there's something, and it's a big matter. Come, 4th brother, let's go inside and talk." Xianxia nodded slightly. He took out the key from his space belt and opened the door of the dormitory. The door of this dormitory was newly changed. The previous door had already been smashed to pieces by the vice president. When they entered the dormitory, Chaosblade immediately closed the door and said, "4th brother, just now there was a message from home. You're really lucky. I really envy you." Hearing this, Xianxia's face revealed a trace of confusion. He asked puzzledly, "Big brother, what's the matter?" Chaosblade walked to Xianxia's bed and sat down. He had a happy smile on his face and said, "4th brother, I guess you don't know yet. Father has already arranged a marriage for you." Hearing this, Xianxia's expression was clearly stunned. He immediately reacted and revealed a trace of disbelief. He exclaimed, "What? A marriage?" Chaosblade fiercely nodded and said happily, "Yes, 4th brother. And the bride is the king's 3rd princess, Princess Jelen. I heard that the king took the initiative to propose this marriage." Hearing this, Xianxia's expression immediately became serious. He was very surprised by this situation. He was even more dissatisfied that his family had decided on his marriage without his consent. This kind of fate that was completely arranged by his family made Xianxia feel extremely disgusted. Seeing Jianshan's expression, Changyang, who thought that Jianshan was worried about the Princess Jelin's appearance. He could not help but chuckle and said, "Fourth brother, don't worry. Although I have never seen the Princess Jelin, I have heard many things about her. The Princess Jelin is the king's third daughter. She is a natural beauty with a face that can cause the downfall of nations. She has been a genius since she was young. Not only is she proficient in the four arts, she is also extremely talented in cultivation. It is said that when she was 15, her saint force had already reached the 7th layer. She is deeply doted on by the king and is the apple of his eye. His Majesty dotes on the Princess Jelin very much." At this point, Changyang, who sighed and said, "Let's not talk about the Princess Jelin's noble status. Just her talent in cultivation is not something that I can compare to. Fourth brother, it is a blessing for you that His Majesty has betrothed the Princess Jelin to you. You don't have to have such a bitter expression." Jianshan sighed inwardly. How could Changyang who understand his thoughts? No matter how beautiful the Princess Jelin was, Jianshan would not be moved. Right now, he only wanted to wholeheartedly increase his strength and did not want to waste time on these matters. Furthermore, he was very clear that His Majesty must have known about his achievements in Kargath Academy. Otherwise, he would not have betrothed his most beloved daughter to him so decisively. Since this marriage was proposed by His Majesty, Jianshan was also clear that he had no power to reject it. Not to mention whether his parents would give up such a good opportunity to befriend the royal family, this was also related to the royal family's reputation. Unless His Majesty took the initiative to withdraw the order, with Jianshan's current status, he could only accept it calmly. However, what made Jianshan feel at ease was that this marriage was only temporarily decided. As for when they would officially get married, this also meant that this marriage could be extended indefinitely. At the very least, it would give him some time to breathe. After all, in his heart, he still did not want to talk about matters of the heart. Furthermore, in his previous life, Jianshan and Xiaoyao had already become accustomed to drifting on the lake. They did not have a fixed residence, the sky as their blanket and the earth as their bed. If there was another person by his side in the future, he would really feel very uncomfortable. After Changyang who left, Jianshan sat alone on the bed and pondered. It had to be said that this news from his family was really too sudden. It actually made Jianshan feel that he was caught unprepared. Sigh. It's better to spend the time on cultivation. After all, only with strength can one decide everything. When my strength is strong enough, even if I take the initiative to cancel the marriage, the king would not say anything. Jianshan let out a long sigh and slowly calmed himself down. Then, he sat cross-legged on the bed and continued to cultivate. Jianshan took out a level 1 magic core from the storage ring, then slowly closed his eyes and began to absorb the energy in the magic core to cultivate. Since Jianshan's strength broke through to the Saint Realm 2 days ago, tonight was the first time he cultivated. For the past 2 nights, he had been familiarizing himself with the use and control of the holy weapon. Just as Jianshan began to absorb the energy in the magic core, the energy in the magic core suddenly flowed faster and faster. In the end, the energy in the magic core was like a runaway horse, crazily surging into Jianshan's body, causing the speed at which Jianshan absorbed the energy to soar to hundreds of times the usual speed in an instant. The sudden change made Jianshan's expression change drastically. Although everyone hoped that they could absorb the energy faster, the speed at which Jianshan absorbed the energy in the magic core had reached a very terrifying speed. Jianshan simply could not refine the energy in the magic core in time. Not only was this not beneficial to him, but it would also bring him endless harm. This was because he could not control the energy that he had not refined. Once such a huge amount of energy ran amok in his body, the consequences would be so great that Jianshan would be doomed eternally. Welcome to Legends of Cultivation audiobooks, where we bring ancient fantasy to life through storytelling. Follow the rise of heroes who defy fate, unlock mystical powers, and battle across celestial realms. Our audiobooks are crafted for fans of Chinese cultivation novels, filled with battles, breakthroughs, and legendary artifacts. Subscribe and be part of an unforgettable journey into the realm of immortality.